Hello, everybody. Happy birthday to me. So, uh, on a personal note, it is my birthday. I am I am Java years old today. Um, that's all I'm going to say. But the day is also rather important because we're kicking off a new initiative on behalf of a lot of open source enthusiasts like myself, and we're trying to understand a lot of new things that are coming about specifically in the security realm. And for that, we have Rahul Jadhav joining us today. Hi, Rahul. Welcome
Hey
to the show.
folks, pleasure, and many happy returns of the day, Ram.
Thank you. So, this is a set of webinars, part of an initiative by AccuKnox. AccuKnox, as you know, and I'm sure Rahul will give a lot more details and perspective. But AccuKnox is a wonderful set of human beings that are tackling very important problems and very interesting problems in the security domain. So I'm just trying to work with them to uncover a lot of the wonderful projects that they have. There's not going to be a lot of emphasis on like how do I buy this, what's the product, etc. But we're going to try and ground this as much as possible in the open source domain that's relevant to, like I said, a lot of technologists that consume open source like myself. But obviously, there might be the odd mention or two about what commercial offerings there are and how best to take advantage of that. With that introduction, Rahul, last I heard, you were CTO and co-founder at AccuKnox. I think that still holds. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself to the
Absolutely,
audience?
absolutely. Thank you, Ram. Thank you, folks, for having me. I'm Rahul Jadhav, one of the co-founders and CTO for AccuKnox. But I wear another hat as well, which is the sixth security chair for Nephio. And that's where primarily this discussion is going to concentrate on. What is it that we're going to do in the context of how we are doing zero trust for 5G deployments, or what our plans are in the context to make sure that our telco deployments are safe for the future.
So this is somewhat niche, Rahul, but I'd still love for our audience to get a little understanding of what's Nephio,
Hmm.
what's the project, etc.
Yeah. So for the beginners, right? Like Nephio is a Linux Foundation networking project. It's a graduated project. This is an initiative that was started by Google, primary for telco domain automation. Now let me entangle that statement there. So telco networks are fundamentally undergoing a paradigm shift. Everyone is moving towards cloud native architectures, orchestrated workloads, containerized workloads, and 5G deployments are no different. Traditionally we have seen SS7 networks. So anyone who remembers 15 years back, we used to have SS7 networks. Then came Cictron networks, which basically made sure that SS7 could be transported on top of IP. Then there were next generation intelligent networks, NGIN, and then now we have a new breed, which is 5G deployments, where except for the radio unit, which is co-located on the tower, everything else is pushed either to the edge, which can be which can be deployed in a data center, or directly in the cloud itself. And this is a reality. Almost every operator in the world is working towards this model. Nephio is trying to automate this whole paradigm in the sense that use Kubernetes native architecture. Everything is a Kubernetes resource model. Every workload, every configuration, you have 10,000 sites to be deployed. It takes 5 minutes to actually, yeah, I mean, it takes the whole rollout is automated, and that's what the primary intention of Nephio is. One more point I would like to just make is, even though we started as telco domain automation framework, it's not necessarily for telcos only. It can be used in general enterprise prices as well. But the first use case that we are targeting is telco networks.
Nice. So I think that kind of specialization is good in terms of targeting a vertical and then building a project to become more general purpose and get it adopted. I mean, obviously, being open source and you know worked on by a lot of different companies is good. I mean, the Linux Foundation does a great job. Thanks, obviously, to a lot of folks that are members, like not unlike AccuKnox, right, and like Google and all of those big
Yeah.
players as well. So ORAN is Open Radio Networks, or
Open Radio Access Network.
Right. So, and that's networking terminology, etc. But before we move on, all of the folks who are viewing this, thank you so much for being here. And any questions that you might have, feel free to pop them into the chat. We have a lot of folks monitoring the YouTube chat, the LinkedIn chat here and there. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask that during the show. I'll try and bring them up in the context of what we're discussing as much as possible. But also, otherwise, if you want to bring up anything that you might not understand, or any TLAs, three-letter acronyms that you're not familiar with, etc. But Rahul, I think you should get started. I'm sure you have some slides and other things
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
showcase.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let
why
let
don't you
let
get started?
let me start by talking about ORAN, right? Like an Open Radio Access Network. That's a fundamental architecture change that has happened in 5G, and the thought process is this: that today we have networks that are fast enough. Why not push everything apart from the radio unit, from the which sits along with the tower, back to the control plane, right? Like, which could be in the data center. Now, why do we do that in the first place? The most important thing that you get with that is your towers or your far edge equipment becomes much more lightweight. Most of the operational expenses for an operator is maintaining those radio units and towers, maintaining cooling for those. So if we just maintain radio units there and push the CUs, DUs, which is basically control units and distribution units, back to the control plane in the cloud or in the data center, you've saved a lot of resources at the end, in the last mile, and that gives you power efficiency and everything else. Your operational expenses reduces. And another thing that ORAN does is that they have broken up the modules. Like, typically previously used to have radio unit, control unit, and distribution unit as part of a single box, and they used to interact with among themselves, and every vendor had their own proprietary interfaces. Now ORAN basically has standardized these interfaces. You see a lot of interfaces that are mentioned here. Let me give you one example. So when a user equipment subscribes or does registration, let's go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah. So there is a telemetry that is generated, and that telemetry is consumed by a set of XApps. These XApps are essentially control point control plane modules, which can then operate on top of that telemetry to provide next generation services, such as you can do power optimization, you can do antenna optimization, beamforming, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of possibilities. Now, why is it important in the context of why are we discussing this in the context of security? Is primarily because the fundamental architectural difference that ORAN brings in is disaggregation and democratization. The point is, all of these modules are changed into atomic units, kept separately. The interfaces are standardized, which means disaggregation. And now you can have each of these modules can be independently brought in by different vendors, which means no dependency on a single vendor, and you get best of the breed from all of these. But the primary problem that happens usually when such kind of disaggregation happens is, hey, now the security risk also increases manifold, because now the attackers has much more access points to tap into, let me put it that way. And hence this discussion.
Sure. So is this also a consequence of a lot of these becoming software defined
Yeah,
over the years?
yeah. Actually, software model was adopted, like you might have seen previously, CNFs, VNFs based deployments, cloud native functions, virtualized functions in the context of telco automation. So already softwareization had the process had started, I would say, roughly 10-12 years back when I was but this is essentially disaggregating even that software module itself, so that you can tap into multiple different aspects of telemetry.
Right, right. And what are sort of the attack vectors and
Yeah,
patterns,
yeah.
and
So
where
let's
do
go
you
to the
see
next.
threats?
Yeah, let's go to
Yeah.
the next. This slide talks about one aspect where
Hmm.
there is this slide gives you an example of a sample vertical use case. It's an industrial ORAN situation. Let's assume that there is a conveyor belt with all sorts of sensors, right? Like, there could be camera based sensors, or there could be sensors who are checking whether the quality of the material that is getting shipped on top of those conveyor belts are good, or things like that. It's typical smart manufacturing vertical use case. Now, when it comes to 5G, and 5G plays a major role here primarily because you can't use wired network in a lot of these cases. You don't have enough real estate, or you can't really put in wired networks in these cases. 5G has fundamentally changing the way in which these deployments can happen. But at the same time, now the wireless access medium presents itself, there is a threat in the context of these itself. uh, for example, if a rogue device gets introduced, is it possible for us to identify a rogue device? If I talked about XApps taking intelligent decisions in the context of end user equipments, changing power transmission parameters, changing modulation parameters to improve power efficiency of this last mile devices. All of this is possibly an attack surface as well. For example, imagine a rogue XApps get into this control plane and then starts directing these E2SM, or E2 service model, RC, which is RAN control commands, to these end devices. This could create complete chaos, and in the worst case situation that can happen if a conveyor belt starts operating in a defective or malicious manner is, you can have mass recall of products, you can have fatalities, right, because of these defective products and things like that. So the worst case scenario is huge. So businesses are already asking, yeah, hey, you have an ORAN based deployment, you're optimizing everything, but what are you doing for security? And that's where some of the attack surfaces that I mentioned here.
So, has there been any reported case of an attack? I mean, some of this feels theoretical to me, which is like
Yes, yes.
great.
Yeah, yeah.
But any recent reports?
So the end device based attacks have already been they've already been happening. Tesla has reported an attack in their premises. XApp based attacks, control plane based attacks, are still not have not been reported as yet, because essentially ORAN networks have still not been deployed at that scale as of now. Typically, the softwareization has happened for these modules, which is CU, DU, and RU. But the ORAN, the blue box that you see on the right hand side, which says 5G ORAN control plane, this
Hmm.
modules now, most of the vendors and operators are now moving towards this ORAN control plane module, but it's still not there as yet. It's in the making, and there's a lot of work happening in the context. So the last mile attacks, where already the manufacturing units have been targeted, that's already played up in real world. But the control plane attacks have not still showed up as much as because of the non it has not proliferated as much as we want.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Now we've been talking about security issues, right? Like, this is one example, another example that Ram you brought out, right? Like, how do we see that there are already attacks in place? And
Hmm.
these are some of the some of the popular open sources that are being made use of in the context is Open 5Gs. That's a 5G core. OAI stacks, Open Air Interface stack, which is very widely used in context of every open source
Hmm.
based deployment, and so on and so forth, right? Like SRS RAN is another one. A very simple analysis by one of our one of the university team. They made an analysis of all these open source 5G cores and ORAN deployments, and they found a lot of attack surfaces open. 100 security flaws were found in LTE and 5G network implementation. It's what we, and we see this ourselves as well as part of Nephio. When we do scanning of images, when we do scanning of this, in most of these cases, the developers are trying to push for functionality. The security usually takes a backseat. With
Hmm.
Nephio, one of the best decisions that as a community that we have taken is make sure that we have security by design, in the sense that we ensure that all the development that we do, all the operators that we write, Kubernetes operators, controllers that we write, are secure by design right from day one. But as you can see here, right, like, there are already flaws there that are getting reported as part of LT and 5G networks.
Right.
I'm not sure if you might have remember, there was a salt typhoon attack that happened in US, United States telecom
Hmm.
deployments.
Hmm.
These were basically there was a traditional network, and the attacker targeted the traditional network, 2G 3G networks, and then moved on to the upgraded networks from those networks, and then uh, penetrated. I mean, it made a huge headlines, and there were a lot of high profile uh, people that were targeted because of that attack. And this was very recent, like
I see.
year, month and a half back.
Oh, okay.
Now, what is it that Nephio is doing? I would like to just introduce some of the high-level philosophy and then go into the specific. Now, when it comes to zero trust, almost everyone talks about it, right? Like everyone talks about it
Yeah,
in the sense
yeah,
that
it's everywhere.
it's everywhere. Hey, you need to be zero trust. What does it
Yeah,
usually? And people talk about paradigm, philosophy, strategy, least permissive, deny by default, just-in-time access, always verify, trust but always verify. These kind of
yeah.
acronyms and statements and proverbs have been thrown. Our intention with Nephio is to actually go into the design and implementation specific points, like what does it actually mean to have a least permissive setting in the context of an ORAN deployment. What which all places the least permissive settings can come into effect. Is it network only, is it systems, is it APIs, or all three of them? What are the enforcement for point for all of these? What kind of DevOps changes would be required to ensure that the least permissive security posture remains intact over a period of time. It's not a point in time stature, right? Like, or a posture. It has to remain intact over a period of time. How do you do this multi-stage automation? Your workloads are getting dev stage and then pushed into production environment when the tens of thousands of edge sites are going to get deployed. How do you maintain this
Mm-hmm.
multi-stage automation? And then finally, blueprints, right? Like, you can't actually say that we're going to discover the workload profile in the production environment itself. So you need to ensure that the workloads that are getting deployed into target 5G network are already profiled. A security blueprint already exists for those workloads, and then that gets deployed along with the workload itself. So there are a bunch of design and implementation points that Nephio as a team has been thinking. So apart from ensuring software best practices, supply chain best practices. When I say software best practices, the development
Right,
best practices, for example,
right.
having good OpenSSF score, ensuring OpenSSF badge the objective, the subjective assessment of OpenSSF badge has been taken care of. All those are very important. Supply chain aspects are very important, ensuring that all the container images are signed, and anyone can verify the authenticity of the images that they are going to deploy in the target environment. And in fact, during deployment itself, you have to ensure that only the verified images are actually deployed. Those are there, and then once they are actually deployed, how do you actually ensure that even if there is a zero-day attack, assuming that the attacker is already in the network, how do you ensure that the malicious intents can't be fulfilled? That's basically
Right.
the aim for this whole architecture. So we are talking about design and implementation phase here. We are trying to get into the
Got it.
weeds here, going and trying to check what is it that we can specifically do in the context of Nephio, because here we have a full framework. And zero trust pillars, again, this is again a widely discussed topic.
Right.
It's a great image, right? Like, it gives you all the primary pillars for zero trust. It's identity. You have to ensure that devices, networks, and application workloads all have least permissive visibility and analytics, automation, orchestration, governance, compliance, as well as data. So these are great pillars, but under the hood, what exact work is required to be done? And in the context
Yeah,
of,
I
yeah,
think I've only heard of people talk about zero trust in the context of applications and identity.
yeah,
The
yeah,
rest of the stuff nobody is talking about.
yeah. And identity, devices and networks, unless and until you have identity handled properly, you can't really
Right.
talk about onboarding, secure onboarding of the devices itself. So in some way, these are interrelated. I would like to explain with Nephio what is our viewpoint
Sure.
in context to each of these pillars. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah. Now, what I have here is the same diagram, but in the boxes, the callouts there, I've mentioned two things. One is the release. So, just for information, Nephio community did an R4 release
Mm-hmm.
a couple of weeks back. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
mid of Feb. We did an R4 release. So we have already done three releases in the past. This is the fourth release that we have done. And one of the important thing that we did as part of R4 release is worked upon something called as workload identity. And we have based it on something called as SPIFFY, or Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone. That basically allows two things. It ensures that the attestation of the identity happens in a secure way. Second is the provisioning of the credentials. Once the attestation of the identity happens, the provisioning of the credentials happen in the secure way, and then the rotation of these credentials over a period of time, it happens in a secure way. All of these three facets are extremely important when it comes to identity management solutions, right? Like so that's an important work item that got merged or handled as part of R4 release as part of Nephio. Next, we are as part of R5. So currently, we have started embarked on an R5 release
Mm-hmm.
journey. So apart from the code security, IAC security, infrastructure as code security, all of those aspects, we have also undertaking we are undertaking a bold work about creating security blueprints for networks and applications, and networks and applications. That's our primary aim. What does it mean? What it means is that when it comes to 5G workloads, right? Like you have specific vendors or specific open sources de- who have developed those kind of applications. For example, UPF, SMF, AMF, all these are network functions for 5G core, and there are only so
Mm-hmm.
many service providers or vendors who have actually developed those functions. We basically are what we are doing is we are starting with open source stacks such as OAI as well as Open 5Gs as well as Free 5GC. These Open 5Gs and Free 5GC are the two 5G core systems, core solutions that are available in the open source, and OAI is Open Air Interface, which operates on the ORAN as well as on the CUDU E2 node side. E2 node
Mm-hmm.
side. Our intention is to create security blueprints for those applications, which means that hey, we have seen this application in operation. These are the network connections that it requires. These are the application behavior that it emits, and this is the API behavior that it expects to have. Create a security blueprint, keep it as part of Artifact Hub, and when the workload is deployed, along with the workload, these security blueprints are also deployed. So this is an advanced model that we are moving towards in R5. Again, this will be handled in multiple phases. I don't think in R5 release itself we'll be able to complete the whole security blueprint. Our intention is to achieve security blueprint for OAI stack at least.
Got
That's
it.
And then there's so and so forth, right? Like as automation and continuous assessment and monitoring and verification using CI/CD workflows. This is improving over a period of time. With
Sure.
R3, that work started. It has already improved a lot.
Mm-hmm.
With R4, we are taking it to the next level by integrating IAC code scanning as well as Kubernetes manifest scanning, operator scanning, and all those aspects we are integrating. As well as when it comes to runtime, as part of R5 release, there is a observability monitoring and analytics engine that is now getting pushed into Nephio, which means that you'll get real-time observability, monitoring, and analytics of the workloads that are deployed in the 5G network. With R6, we are targeting ORAN specific telemetries. Which is E2 interface. For example, I previously mentioned about power modulation schemes getting changed at runtime.
Mm-hmm.
There is a limit telemetry and RC commands that are emitted as part of that. Observing all of those and monitoring and keeping thresholds on top of it, all of these aspects are going to be taken care of as
Got
well.
it. Got
So
it.
this in a way gives us gives the community a roadmap to work towards, right? Like a final vision to
Oh
work
yeah. I think this makes it very relatable. Like a lot of the work that goes on in the open source community
towards.
can feel abstract to a lot of people at times. But I think this mapping between um, zero trust characteristics versus the work that the community is doing, I think it's very useful in creating a mind map of where things are.
Absolutely, that's precisely the intention. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
let's
let
move
let let,
along. Yeah.
let let's move to the next slide. Yeah, this is one of the example. Again, anyone who has used Spiffy already might be familiar with the diagram that you see here. Essentially, a Spiffy URL as part of the yellow box. What you see is a Spiffy
Mm-hmm.
URL or a Spiffy ID, which says what is the identity of that particular workload, and that identity is manifested as part of that ID, and that identity is part of something called as a credential, which is SVID, a SPIFFY verifiable identity document. It could be X509 certificate or a JOT token, which ensures that it is cryptographically protected identity document. Now, the intention of identity, like I mentioned before, is to make sure that the workloads are attested, which means that the workloads will claim that I am this particular workload with these particular attributes. A control plane will take those attributes and do an verification in a in a synchronous way, saying that hey,
Mm-hmm.
these attributes are verified, attested, and now you can have this credential, which will tell that this is the identity that you have. Once you have that control plane, then everything else becomes authorization problem. So this takes care of authentication, identity provisioning, as well as authentication problem. So in this case, the example that you see here, FOCOM and SMO is basically service management and orchestration platform, part of ORAN, and OCloud. These are two highly decoupled functions. SMO uses functions from OCloud, but it requires to know whether it's actually calling the right OCloud function, and vice versa. OCloud needs to know that it's actually connected to the right SMO. All of this can happen only if you have the right way to do authentication and authorization flows. And authorization comes later, so authentication has to happen before. And for authentication, you need an identity strategy in place, and that's what essentially SPIFFy allows us to do. We have detailed demo videos as to how this work was done over the past 8 to 10 months. By the way, folks, it was not a month's of work. So we've been
Sure.
at it for the last 8 to 10 months. In fact, six security working group, or a six security SIG itself, was
Mm-hmm.
formed in October 2023. So it's
Right.
been it's been there for like maybe year and a half now. Yeah. So one of the most important, and one of the background for that formation was, hey, when we formed, when the SIG security SIG was formed as part of Nephio, the question was, hey, what kind of action items that can we undertake? People were talking about using Vault, people were talking about using service mesh, people were talking about using network segmentation. But
Mm-hmm.
then when we dig deeper, when we started creating user stories, almost each of this action item required that identity to be in place. Like
Got
how
it.
do we, so then the six security came together and said that, hey, we have to keep everything on back burner, we have to make sure that we have the identity nailed properly, and then we can work on every other aspect. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how the mindset happened. But again, yeah, like it's not one dimension. Identity is important, but
Sure.
continuous assessment of all the assets. It could include code repositories, container images, infrastructure code, as well as the workloads that are deployed in the runtime, right? Like all of these needs continuous assessment. And a lot of Linux Foundation projects, Linux Foundation team is helping us out there, OSSF practices,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
we ensure that all of the key repositories are actually used, are OSSF. We have a scorecard attached to it. We are very
Fantastic.
we are very proud that we brought the score. So when we started, when the SIG security was formed, the LSF OpenSSF scorecard was 3.6, which was very bad.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
In 6 months' time, we brought it to 7.1.
Nice.
I mean, we added all the, and again, just the ability to have just a way to see what are the best practices to be followed in a single place, and being able to get a score in the context, immense help, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
kudos to OpenSSF team. Similarly, for container images, it's not a it's not just that you have to scan the container images when they are created. A vulnerability can is database is updated every 6 hours.
Right.
So once the image is pushed to the registry, you have to periodically keep on scanning the container registries itself for vulnerabilities. So it's a periodic continuous assessment of these assets that you have to do. Similarly
Mm-hmm.
for core infrastructure code, right? Like you don't know when the vulnerability can be reported. You have to do a continuous assessment.
Right.
And in a lot of these cases, right, like the release cadence of Nephio is once in 6 months. So every 6 months to 8 months is when we do a R4, R3 release, R4 release,
Mm-hmm.
next
Mm-hmm.
release. In 6 months, a lot of things change. We want to
Sure.
make sure that in a week's time, a lot of things change these days. But yeah, 6 months is a very big time. Yeah. On the other side, the runtime assessment, we have already talked about security blueprints. Our intention is to make sure that apart from the workloads, the security blueprints are shipped along with the application workloads itself. That's what we are trying to achieve. Yeah. Let's go to the next line. Yeah, this is again an important and interesting work item. So people usually talk about security policies and rules. Imagine having 10,000 edge sites, and some of these edge sites might not exactly be, they're not homogeneous deployments. Like they don't replicate themselves, right? Like to be able to manage policies and rules in the context of each of this deployment is a gigantic task. You can't achieve it without automation. One of the work that we had perceived is a work called as intent driven security automation, where you have a Kubernetes operator which is
Mm.
deployed as part of the work, which is deployed as part of the control plane itself, which checks what kind of engines are available in the target environment, what kind of CNIs are present, what kind of other security engines are available, or what kind of Kubernetes control plane security options are available, and then checks the security blueprints in the context and pulls in the rules and policies accordingly and deploys it
Hmm.
in the target Kubernetes cluster. That reconciliation is handled by this operator. So, and finally, you get a report saying, hey, these were the security intents that were supposed to be in the context of this deployment. We see that 60% of those security intents are fully satisfied, 10% of them are partially satisfied. We have put in some checks but not complete checks, and then 30% are not satisfied at all, and we give a reason why they are not satisfied. This is the rule which we couldn't enforce, and things like that.
Oh, fantastic.
Complete automation. This is something that we presented in one summit 2024 as part of Nephio community, and
Nice.
we got a great reception.
Yeah, I can totally see how this can be useful. I mean, I'll tell you this,
Hmm.
and this might be a little controversial for today's time, but it's nice to see a non AI intent based automation framework. I mean, I'm not against AI or anything like that, but it's a lot of distraction to me personally. But this is more grassroots. This sort of um, tackles the problem extremely well, because there's so many people defining so many different policy things and putting them into production and making them operational. But it's wonderful to have something that can sort of aggregate the status
Bind
of
them
how
together.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is fantastic. I wasn't aware of this, so thank you for showing me something so cool.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to the next slide, and then final approach. Final approach in the sense that eventually what operators or service providers would care for is two things. A, the security blueprint is actually deployed in the target environment. Do a continuous assessment, for example risk assessment, in the sense that can you do adversarial emulation on those workloads and check whether actually something can be attacked. So in that context, we are making use of MITRE Caldera for adversarial emulation.
Hmm.
Again, a brilliant tool from MITRE.
Hmm.
We love it. It's an amazing way to actually specify abilities, adversarial abilities, and attack specific workloads. But more importantly, right, like what we have tried attempted is, once the CNFs or ORAN components are deployed in the target environment, we get a compliance report which says that, hey, these are the deviations that you see from the security blueprints that are deployed there. These deviations have to be first captured, and then you need to talk to the vendors. Like a lot of times vendors might have good reasons to actually have these deviations, and if they have good reasons, then you can add in deviation to this blueprint. But this whole process brings in credibility, accountability to any deviations that are actually captured. And that's what the intent of this whole thing is, right? Like, we want to capture network slicing based use cases, service based architecture, zero trust assessment. All of these is great, but unless and until you have checks and balances, continuous assessment, and certification program, you can't actually finally say that, hey, this deployment is secure. Is secure in the
Right.
sense, and all the best practices are followed. Those security blueprints are deployed. This is the final intention of what we want to bring to the table from the operator's point of view. From if you have to sell security to vendors, right, like this is what they would be looking for eventually. How do I assess the security posture?
Got it. Got it. And so this is sort of now available as an open source project, part
Yes.
of the Nephio release.
Yes.
Hmm.
It's not part of Nephio itself. Eventually, it will be part of Nephio.
Right.
Currently, it's
Right.
maintained. It's maintained as part of a different GitHub repository. Some of
Hmm.
the some of the some of the work that I've mentioned here, for example, workload identity, it's already part of Nephio. In fact, it's
Sure.
part of the release. But
Sure.
some of the security blueprints is a work that we have started in R5. It's in
Okay.
different repo, but our intention is to eventually bring it as part of Nephio and make sure that we have the full uh, solution out of the box, right? Like apart from the automation framework, the security automation also happens.
So Nephio aims to be the vendor neutral open source
Yes. Yes.
tool. Is there an additional AccuKnox sort of layer on top of it that you're also promoting, or just the open source project?
Currently, we are heavily involved in open source. Basically, our
Okay,
intention currently is to build value. We also
sure.
have an enterprise version where you can onboard all these edge deployments and have a single pane of glass where you will be able to see how these edge clusters are behaving. If there is
Hmm.
alerts and monitoring, you have to do aggregation, you have to have integrations with sim tooling, and all the soc analysis have to happen. All of that is in the enterprise version. That is how we are envisaging it, but right
Got
now
it.
our focus is primarily in building value along with the community.
Fantastic. No, I think this has been extremely useful, Rahul. I definitely picked up a thing or two that I wasn't aware of before. And, it's just wonderful to see progress, especially in the open source front, and especially with all of these wonderful tools that are, you know, bringing the community together more than anything. And, tackling all of these interesting problems. And, um, not a lot of people are fully aware of how much deep work it takes to build systems, keep them running, but also keep them secure.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thank you for doing all of this and sharing it with the larger community.
Thank you, Ram. As usual, appreciate the time and the reach here. Thank you very much.
Sure, Rahul. For those who are watching, I really hope you like the show. Rahul is always a great guest. It was like I said, it was fun watching a lot of these things. There's more to come. So, our upcoming episode is a week from today. If you're interested in Kubernetes and cloud native and security for Kubernetes and cloud native, I highly recommend that you check it out. All of this information is available on some of the AccuKnox pages. But if you follow us on socials, like me or the AccuKnox socials, you'll come to know of what exactly the sessions are and what they deal with. Hope to see you in a future episode. Once again, thank you, Rahul,
Thank
and
you.
thank you
Thank
everybody for watching.